Jim Parker, a war hero, is pulled over by a rookie cop for driving too slow on an empty suburban street. The ticket feels like a betrayal, igniting quiet fury beneath his calm. But this wasn't just about speed, it was about respect. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over Elmwood Lane, where Jim Parker eased his old pickup along the quiet street. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming lilacs, a stark contrast to the sterile tension Jim felt under the hood of his truck. Every mile he drove home had been marked by the steady rhythm of careful judgment, a habit honed by decades in the Army, where a single misstep could cost lives. His hands, calloused and steady, gripped the wheel not out of nervousness, but out of an ingrained respect for order and safety. Jim's mind drifted briefly to memories of his final deployment, how a cautious approach had prevented an ambush, saved his squad from disaster. Those lessons, etched deeply in his bones, now guided his driving. He kept the speed low, mindful of pedestrians, wary of stray children, and respectful of the neighborhood's quiet peace. There was no rush. There never was. But today, that care was mistaken for obstruction. A flash of red and blue lights erupted behind him, jolting Jim from his reverie. He pulled over with practiced ease, his expression calm but wary as Officer Mark Benson approached. Mark was fresh out of the academy, brimming with the zeal of youth and a hunger to make his mark. To Mark, the law was a clear line to enforce. No exceptions, no gray zones. Slow driving was a disruption, plain and simple. "Sir, you're impeding traffic," Mark said, voice firm but lacking warmth. "You need to maintain the flow." Jim looked up, confusion knitting his brow. The road was empty save for his truck and the distant flash of a jogger far behind. "I'm not blocking anyone," Jim replied evenly. "I'm driving safe. No one's behind me." Mark's jaw tightened, his badge reflecting the late afternoon sun as he scribbled on his ticket pad. "It's about the principle, sir. You can't slow down traffic." The ticket landed on Jim's windshield like an insult, a petty reprimand from a man who didn't understand the weight behind those deliberate miles. For Jim, it wasn't about speed, it was about responsibility, a principle he had lived by under fire and peace alike. The law, in Mark's hands, felt like a blunt instrument, wielded without regard for context or humanity. News of the ticket spread quickly through Elmwood. Social media lit up with outrage, neighbors sharing photos of the citation, tagging veterans groups, and demanding justice. Jim, once a quiet pillar of the community, was suddenly thrust into the glare of public scrutiny. The irony was bitter. Here was a man who had served his country only to be punished for something as trivial as cautious driving. Jim sat at his kitchen table that evening, the ticket folded neatly beside his worn Army medals. His wife, Linda, watched him with concern. "They don't see what you see," she said softly. "To them, it's just a ticket, but to us, it's more." He nodded, the weight settling deeper in his chest. His motivation had always been clear: protect, preserve, serve. Yet this small act of enforcement had turned into a wound, a sign that the respect he thought earned was fragile, easily dismissed by those who knew nothing of sacrifice. Officer Benson, meanwhile, wrestled with his own sense of justice. He wasn't a villain, just a man trying to uphold the rules in a world that seemed increasingly complex. To him, the law was black and white, a necessary order in chaotic times. Yet, as the backlash grew, he felt the sting of unintended consequences, the gap between authority and empathy yawning wider. The stage was set, not just a story about a traffic ticket, but a clash of values, of generations, of the delicate balance between order and understanding. Jim's slow drive had become a flashpoint, a catalyst for a community's reckoning with how it honors its heroes and how justice is truly served. The quiet road home had transformed into a battleground for respect, dignity, and the meaning of service itself. Word of Jim Parker's ticket spread beyond Elmwood's quiet streets, carried swiftly through the tight-knit network of veterans who had fought shoulder to shoulder with him over decades of service. Among them were retired generals, men whose careers had been forged in the crucible of war, tempered by years of command and unyielding discipline. These men knew Jim not as a slow driver on a suburban road, but as a soldier whose steady hand and measured decisions had saved lives. To them, the ticket wasn't just a legal formality, it was an affront, a glaring misjudgment that cut deep into the fabric of respect that bound their brotherhood. The generals convened quietly in their private circles, their discussions deliberate and measured. None sought confrontation or public spectacle. Their motivation was loyalty, pure, unyielding loyalty to a man whose integrity had never wavered. They understood the nuance behind Jim's cautious driving, recognizing it as an extension of his character, a manifestation of the discipline ingrained through years of service. The slow pace wasn't defiance nor recklessness. It was a practiced caution, an ethic of care that had defined Jim's life both on and off the battlefield. With this in mind, they crafted a response that was both powerful and dignified. A motorcade to escort Jim on his drive home, a procession of reverence rather than rebellion. The plan was simple, yet resonant. A convoy of vehicles bearing the flags and insignias of their respective commands, an unspoken declaration of honor. These were not noisy protests, but solemn reminders that Jim's story was part of a greater narrative, one that celebrated sacrifice and upheld the bonds forged in the harshest conditions. On the morning of the motorcade, Elmwood's streets transformed from sleepy and unremarkable to a stage for respect and solidarity. The hum of engines blended with the rustling of flags, the colors of service, Army greens, Navy blues, Air Force grays, fluttering proudly in the gentle breeze. Vehicles ranged from polished Jeeps to classic trucks, each bearing the marks of years spent in service and the personal histories of those who rode within. Jim's own truck was at the center, steady and unpretentious, embodying the quiet strength that had earned this extraordinary show of support. The generals rode with him, or close behind, their presence commanding yet unassuming, like statues carved from duty and honor. The motorcade moved deliberately, not to provoke, but to proclaim, to declare that Jim Parker's life was not defined by a hastily written ticket, but by the countless acts of courage and caution that had shaped his identity. As the procession rolled through the town, curious neighbors stepped out of their homes, cameras lifted to capture the unusual scene. Whispers of recognition spread. Veterans recognized old comrades. Families saw the flags and badges. Children watched with wide eyes. The motorcade was a living tribute, a lesson in respect delivered not with words, but with presence. Among the onlookers stood Officer Mark Benson, his uniform stark against the morning light. Watching the steady flow of vehicles, the solemn faces, and the proud banners, Mark felt an unexpected weight settle in his chest. The motorcade was more than a statement. It was a mirror held up to his own assumptions. He hadn't meant to insult or diminish Jim's service. He had only sought to uphold the letter of the law. But the sight before him fractured his certainty, revealing the complexity he had overlooked. In that moment, Mark wrestled with a deepening awareness that law enforcement required more than rigid rules. It demanded understanding, context, and empathy. The motorcade was not a challenge to his authority, but an invitation to see beyond the surface, to recognize the human stories woven into every interaction. The unexpected alliance of these retired generals and Jim Parker reshaped the narrative from one of conflict to one of connection. It was a reminder that justice, when tempered by compassion, could transcend the simple dichotomies of right and wrong. And for the town of Elmwood, the motorcade was a quiet turning point, a collective breath drawn in respect for a man whose slow drive had sparked a profound dialogue about honor, duty, and the meaning of true service. The reverberations of the motorcade rolled through Elmwood like a rising tide, reshaping the atmosphere with a palpable shift in perception. What began as a quiet, almost invisible act of injustice, a ticket handed down for careful driving, had been transformed into a powerful narrative of honor, respect, and collective conscience. Local news stations, initially poised to report a mundane traffic violation, instead captured the essence of something far greater, a community rallying to affirm the dignity of a man who had given his life in service. Headlines moved swiftly from "Veteran ticketed for slow driving" to "Community honors retired Sergeant Jim Parker," with footage of the motorcade weaving through Elmwood streets playing on every channel. The solemn procession, bathed in the colors and symbols of military service, struck a chord beyond the confines of the town. Viewers across the region saw more than vehicles and flags. They saw a living testament to loyalty and sacrifice, embodied in the steady figure of Jim Parker. The story resonated not just as a matter of local interest, but as a broader statement on how society values its veterans. As public opinion swelled, city officials found themselves under intense scrutiny. The petition signatures, social media posts, and calls flooded City Hall, demanding a reconsideration of the ticket. For the first time, many officials confronted the human face behind bureaucratic decisions. This was not a mere traffic case. It was a test of the community's values. Within days, a formal review was convened. The charge of impeding traffic was quietly but firmly dropped. An official apology was drafted and delivered, not just to clear Jim's name, but to acknowledge the deeper mistake, the failure to recognize the context behind his driving. The apology was more than a piece of paper. It was a gesture of reconciliation, a rare admission of fault that rippled through the local government and law enforcement. Mark Benson, the young officer who had issued the ticket, took the step few would have expected. He reached out personally to Jim Parker, offering a letter and a conversation marked by humility. In his words, there was a recognition that justice could not be blind to honor, that service demanded more than strict rule enforcement. It required empathy, respect, and a willingness to listen. For Jim, this gesture held profound significance. The initial sting of the ticket had cut sharply, stirring feelings of hurt and confusion. Yet this act of contrition rekindled a hope he had quietly nurtured, that the system could still bend toward fairness, that those sworn to uphold the law could see beyond black and white regulations to the complex truths of human experience. His pain transformed into something richer, a renewed belief in the power of community and the possibility of healing wounds through understanding. But the triumph extended beyond Jim alone. The motorcade, the apology, the public outcry, they coalesced into a symbol of unity and respect that resonated deeply among veterans across the region. Jim's story became a touchstone for others who had quietly borne the burdens of service, often feeling invisible or misunderstood in civilian life. His experience reminded them, and the wider public, that honor transcends rules, that true justice must consider the whole person, and that communities can rise together to defend what is right. In the days that followed, Elmwood felt a subtle but lasting change. Conversations emerged in homes, schools, and local businesses about the importance of respect for those who serve. The narrative of Jim Parker's slow drive and the ensuing motorcade became a teaching moment, an inspiring example that small acts, whether a cautious turn behind the wheel or the decision to stand together in solidarity, could challenge injustice and foster healing. The story closed not on a note of bitterness or division, but with the quiet strength of dignity restored. It was a reminder etched into the town's collective memory that even in the smallest corners of daily life, injustice can be confronted with grace. That respect is a currency more valuable than citations or fines, and that the bonds forged in service do not break with the end of duty. They endure, inspiring courage and compassion in all who bear witness.